Why did the captain suddenly stop the entire flight? For an old man, no one seemed to notice. He gave up his seat without a fight. He sat in silence, cramped in the last row. But just 9 minutes later, the captain stepped out and did something no one expected. What followed wasn't part of the flight plan. It was a tribute that changed how everyone saw him. Stay with us to see why one quiet veteran brought an entire plane to a standstill. And don't forget to subscribe. The first light of autumn filtered gently through the windows of Jackson Municipal Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floor tiles. Outside, the Tennessee air carried the first hints of seasonal change, crisp and clean with a faint trace of dried leaves and distant chimneys. The sun had just climbed above the horizon, gilding the tops of parked cars and the metal edges of luggage carts being wheeled past slowly. Inside the terminal, the morning unfolded with practiced rhythm. Loudspeaker announcements buzzed overhead, calling passengers to their gates. Families moved in clusters, pulling colorful carry-ons, while business travelers scrolled through emails on their phones, coffee cups balanced on their knees. In the far corner of Gate 4, beside a tall charging station with flickering indicator lights, an older man sat quietly, his presence nearly unnoticed amid the motion. His name was Jonathan Webster. At 81, his posture remained upright, if not a little stiff, and he wore a brown tweed jacket that had seen years of wear but still held its shape. A small discreet pin glinted from his lapel, the winged insignia of the United States Air Force. His hands were folded neatly over one another, the skin marked by age but steady, the nails trimmed with the precision of long habit. A silver wristwatch clung to his left wrist, its glass scratched in places, but the face remained clean and clear. Jonathan had arrived early. He always did. Waiting didn't bother him. It was familiar, a space and time where reflection was allowed. He had left his house before dawn, driving himself in his old Chevy through quiet streets, the headlights cutting through a pale mist. There was no one to drop him off or wave goodbye. He didn't mind. He had learned a long time ago to move quietly through spaces others filled with chatter. His destination was Seattle, a city he hadn't visited in nearly 15 years. His daughter lived there now, and in just 2 days she would celebrate her 20th wedding anniversary. She had invited him months ago, and for once, he had said yes. He had raised her alone after his wife died of cancer, a quiet battle fought and lost while their daughter was still in high school. The years since had been marked by distance, both geographic and emotional, bridged only by holiday calls and carefully worded cards. This event felt like something different, a moment of reconnection, a possibility, however small. Jonathan had purchased the ticket himself, from his pension, carefully saved. No one had offered to cover the cost, and he hadn't asked. He had chosen seat 3D and aisle, business class, not for luxury, but for necessity. 3 years ago, a spinal surgery had changed the way he moved. Sitting for extended periods caused a deep, relentless pain, unless he could rise and stretch. The aisle made that possible. The extra legroom was not indulgence, but relief, a choice made deliberately, privately. Around him, people passed with little notice. No one saw the old man as anything but another traveler. He liked it that way. He had never asked to be seen. He simply waited, breathing evenly, watching the changing light move across the floor. His bag sat beside him, a weathered leather duffel with his initials embossed in gold now faded. Inside, folded shirts, a clean blazer, and a pair of well-worn dress shoes meant for the event. On top of everything, a photo tucked into an inside pocket, his daughter, her husband, and 2 young boys he had never met in person. Jonathan adjusted the strap of his duffel, glanced once more at the gate number, and let his eyes close for a moment. He was early. He always was. But that had never bothered him. In the quiet of waiting, he had always found a kind of peace. When boarding was called for Pacific Sky Flight 587, the terminal stirred into motion. Passengers gathered their belongings, closed laptops, and slipped phones into their pockets. Jonathan Webster rose from his seat with deliberate care, the joints in his back stiff from the weight. He adjusted the strap on his duffel and made his way down the jet bridge at a measured pace, letting others pass without resistance. The walkway buzzed with quiet conversation and the roll of carry-ons, but Jonathan moved in silence, keeping his balance with one hand brushing lightly against the wall. He entered the aircraft and was greeted with the warm air of the cabin, the scent of recycled air mixed with citrusy cleaning products. Row 3 came quickly. Business class was not opulent, but it was clean and calm, with wider seats and softer lighting. He found 3D on the aisle, just as he'd selected, and gently lowered himself into the seat. The cushion was firm but forgiving, and the extra legroom allowed him to extend his left leg just enough to ease the usual tension that crept along his spine. With a quiet exhale, he slid his duffel beneath the seat in front and rested his hands on the armrests. The low hum of air conditioning filled the space. Around him, other passengers continued to board, some chatting, some settling in with neck pillows and earbuds. Jonathan sat still, grateful for the small relief the seat already provided. But the peace didn't last long. A few minutes later, a flight attendant approached. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, her posture straight, but her expression uncertain. She held a tablet in both hands like a shield. Her uniform was crisp, her name badge gleaming under the overhead lights. She paused by Jonathan's row, glanced at her screen, then at him. Her manner was polite but practiced, the way someone might speak while balancing obligation and discomfort. According to the latest seating update, she explained, his seat would need to be reassigned. A company official had been bumped from another flight due to delays and was now to be accommodated in business class on this one. His assigned seat, 3D, was the only remaining open seat that met internal travel protocol. The change, she added quickly, was unexpected. Operational necessity, temporary inconvenience. Jonathan listened calmly. He didn't interrupt. Then, as carefully as before, he explained his reasons for choosing that particular seat. The surgery, the medical discomfort, the specific need for aisle access. His voice was even, without frustration, but his tone held the weight of preparation. This wasn't the first time he'd had to explain his needs to strangers. The flight attendant shifted her weight slightly, glanced down at her tablet, and nodded. She understood, but the instruction had come from above. Corporate level, she added softly, as if that would explain or excuse the decision. She was only following orders. The cabin around them had begun to quiet. Passengers nearby sensed the change in tone, the stall in movement. Some looked up, others tilted their heads just enough to eavesdrop without seeming to. A man 2 rows back narrowed his eyes in confusion. A woman across the aisle adjusted her posture, clearly listening. Jonathan felt their attention like a weight, not angry or cruel, just expectant, waiting to see what he would do. The attendant stood patiently. There was no malice in her face, only duty. Jonathan held her gaze for a moment longer, then slowly nodded. His hands moved to the armrests. He rose with effort, pain flickering across his features for only a second before vanishing. He reached for his duffel and stepped carefully into the aisle. No one said anything. He didn't look around as he made his way to the rear of the aircraft. Row numbers climbed steadily as he walked, past premium seats, past economy. Through the narrowing cabin where overhead bins were already overflowing and conversations grew louder. He moved deliberately, passing parents wrangling toddlers, teenagers with backpacks, couples flipping through magazines. No one offered to trade. No one offered a hand. Row 34 sat near the back, just ahead of the lavatories. The seats were smaller, less padded, wedged tightly together. He found 34B in the center. Already the passengers on either side were seated. To his left, a young man in a hooded sweatshirt scrolled through his phone, earbuds in. To the right, a middle-aged woman read a paperback, eyes darting across the page. Jonathan slid into the middle seat as best he could, turning sideways to lower himself without jarring his spine. His duffel stayed on the floor at his feet. He pressed his hands into his thighs, straightened his back as much as space allowed, and closed his eyes for a moment. No one acknowledged his arrival. No one knew where he had started. He didn't need their sympathy, but the absence of recognition left a quiet hollow behind his ribs. The sharp edge of humiliation didn't come from the reassignment itself, but from the way it was done, swiftly and impersonally. A quiet erasure. His discomfort didn't matter. His story didn't matter. He had become a name on a screen, moved by someone who would never meet him. The airplane cabin continued to buzz around him. Passengers found seats. Overhead compartments clicked shut. But for Jonathan, the space grew smaller, more rigid. The brief moment of comfort he had earned, planned for, and paid for was gone, replaced by the cramped seat between strangers and a dull, familiar ache in his lower back. Still, he sat upright, hands folded, gaze fixed ahead. He would not ask for anything. He would simply endure. The seat in row 34B was narrow, the kind that pressed in on both sides, its cushions still holding the residual warmth of the previous passenger. Jonathan lowered himself into it carefully, angling his body to avoid straining his back more than necessary. Even with all the caution in the world, a sharp bolt of pain ran up his spine as he settled. His jaw clenched, but he made no sound. His face tightened briefly, then relaxed into practiced stillness. He reached for the armrests and held them as if they were anchors, his fingers curling into the plastic edges to steady himself. To his right, a young man in a gray sports jacket with the hood pulled up leaned against the window, headphones firmly in place. His thumb scrolled continuously across a phone screen, eyes locked on something that existed far beyond the narrow confines of row 34. On Jonathan's left, a woman in her early 40s had already opened a paperback novel. She adjusted her reading glasses once and buried herself in the pages, the story occupying all of her focus. Above, the reading light flickered intermittently, unable to find a steady glow. The ventilation system above their row hissed louder than in other parts of the plane, creating a constant undertone of white noise and mechanical breath. The ambient light felt dimmer here, like the rear of the cabin had somehow slipped out of step with the rest of the aircraft. Jonathan sat still, hands folded neatly in his lap, his shoulders slightly hunched to avoid pressing against his neighbors. He didn't attempt to speak. He didn't shift his gaze. The ache in his lower back intensified slowly, not as a spike but as a pressure, unrelenting and low, like a reminder of something forgotten by everyone but him. He breathed through his nose, eyes closed, retreating inward. In his mind, he pictured the seat he had reserved months ago, 3D, the clean lines of the business section, the aisle, the space to rise, to walk. A seat earned not through status but out of need. That seat now belonged to someone else. He hadn't seen who had taken it. It no longer mattered. Around him, the flight continued to fill. Luggage thudded into overhead compartments. Seatbelts clicked. Voices murmured across the aisles. Nearby passengers chatted about weekend plans, vacation itineraries, connecting flights. Phones buzzed with final notifications before airplane mode. But none of it touched him. It moved around him, past him, as though he were transparent, an old man in a worn blazer with a faded Air Force pin invisible to the casual eye. No one offered a glance. No one asked if he needed help or offered to switch. The flight attendants passed through, scanning tickets, giving brief instructions. They paused, smiled, nodded, and moved on. He had become part of the backdrop, a fixture to be acknowledged only if necessary. Jonathan didn't resent them. He didn't even expect better. He had learned long ago that age, once respected, had become easy to overlook. In row 5, closer to the front, a woman sat still in her seat, watching. Her name was Lauren Campbell, a nonprofit consultant traveling to Los Angeles for a conference. She was not directly involved in what had happened, nor had she heard the entire exchange. But she had noticed the moment, the shift in energy, the subtle tilt of posture from the young flight attendant, the silent rise of the elderly man from business class. It was enough. Lauren hadn't taken out her phone. She hadn't made a scene, but her mind stayed occupied with the memory. Her brother, a Marine who had returned home a decade earlier with injuries no one could see, wore that same expression when asked to compromise his dignity for someone else's convenience. Quiet, resigned. The kind of look that spoke of practiced endurance. She hadn't meant to notice, but once she had, it wouldn't leave her. Jonathan, still in his seat, adjusted his legs slightly to relieve the pressure. There wasn't much room to move. The hard plastic edge of the tray table dug into his thigh. The man next to him adjusted his jacket and resumed scrolling. The woman on the other side turned a page. He pressed his spine into the seat back and closed his eyes again. He didn't expect recognition, but the ache he carried now had less to do with his body and more to do with something deeper, a kind of disappearance that came not from time, but from the silence of being overlooked. He had made space for someone else, but no one seemed to notice that he had been there at all. The aircraft moved steadily along the taxiway, its engines rumbling beneath the floor with a quiet, persistent power. Overhead, the cabin lights shifted to a dim amber glow, signaling the final preparations for takeoff. Passengers settled in with the subtle choreography of experience. Belts clicked into place, tray tables locked, eyes flicked down to phones one last time before switching them off. From row to row, the hum of quiet anticipation filled the space. For most, this was the routine beginning of a routine journey. In the cockpit, Captain Eric Sloan reviewed the final checklist, his co-pilot reading off confirmations in a low voice. Outside, the runway lights glimmered faintly in the early afternoon sun. Everything was on schedule. But just before receiving final clearance for takeoff, the cockpit console chimed, an internal alert from Pacific Sky's Operations Department. Sloan tapped the screen and brought up the message. A red banner displayed an urgent personnel notice. Passenger Jonathan Webster, age 81, reassigned from seat 3D to 34B due to last-minute seating override. Noted medical needs. Status: United States Air Force veteran. Vietnam. 2 confirmed combat missions. Recipient of Air Medal for Valor Under Fire. Details included a reference to spinal injury requiring aisle access. Sloane's fingers hovered over the screen. He reread the note twice. The name stirred something in the back of his mind. Not a person he had known directly, but one he had heard of. Perhaps in a briefing years ago, or listed in a report he had once signed off on during his own service. It didn't matter. What mattered now was the situation. Someone had moved an elderly veteran with documented medical needs from a business class seat he had purchased to one of the most uncomfortable spots on the plane. The captain did not hesitate. He reached for the intercom and calmly instructed the ground crew to pause the taxi procedure. Then he turned to his co-pilot and nodded. No words were exchanged. Sloane unfastened his harness, stood, and straightened his uniform. The gold stripes on his sleeves reflected the ambient light. His expression remained calm, but his jaw had tightened, and there was a new resolve in his posture. The door to the cockpit opened with a soft click, and the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted almost instantly. Flight attendants paused, glancing toward the front with uncertain eyes. Passengers near the front rows turned to look. Conversations trailed off. Sloane stepped into the aisle with the quiet gravity of someone accustomed to command, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Without a word, he began walking. He moved with purpose, his gaze fixed ahead, scanning seat numbers as he passed. He walked past row 5, then 10, then 20. The rows grew narrower. The overhead bins more cluttered, the passengers younger, louder, more chaotic. The further he went, the more attention he drew. People shifted in their seats, eyebrows rose, phones lowered. A few murmured quietly, uncertain of what was happening but aware that something unusual was unfolding. He passed row 30, then slowed as he reached the very back, row 34. Near the lavatories, the hum of the engines louder here, the air just a little warmer, less circulated. He stopped beside the middle seat in the row. Jonathan Webster sat with his back straight despite the discomfort, his hands neatly folded over his stomach. His eyes were closed, his expression unreadable. He didn't notice the captain at first, but then, sensing the shift around him, the sudden hush, the subtle withdrawal of air, he opened his eyes and looked up. Their eyes met. Captain Sloane stood tall, his uniform crisp, his posture perfect. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Sloane raised his right hand and delivered a formal military salute, sharp, precise, unmistakable. The entire cabin fell into complete silence. The noise from the engines faded beneath the weight of the moment. Conversations died. Even the rustling of magazines and the tapping of fingers on plastic armrests ceased. Passengers in the nearby rows turned to watch, their expressions shifting from confusion to something softer, recognition perhaps, or respect. The captain lowered his hand and gave a slight nod. He didn't need to explain the gesture. It wasn't protocol, it was something older and deeper than that. He turned to the lead flight attendant who had followed several steps behind. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, still processing what was happening. Sloane instructed her quietly to relocate Mr. Webster to seat 1A, the most spacious, most accessible seat in the cabin. She nodded once, understanding. Jonathan looked between them, not fully comprehending, his brow furrowed slightly, as if questioning whether this was truly happening. But the attendant gently placed a hand on the headrest beside him and waited. Slowly, deliberately, Jonathan rose from his cramped seat. The motion brought pain, but he masked it well, steadying himself on the armrest before reaching for his bag. Passengers in nearby rows shifted to make space. A young man removed his headphones and tucked them into his jacket. The woman with the paperback book placed it face down on her tray and looked up, eyes thoughtful. For the first time since he had boarded, Jonathan was no longer invisible. He stepped into the aisle, moving carefully. The pain was still there, but now he walked upright, supported not by anyone's hand but by something more intangible. Dignity returned. As he moved forward, passengers parted. Some nodded. One man touched 2 fingers to his temple. A woman resting a sleeping child on her shoulder offered a smile. The captain walked behind him, silent but present. The long aisle, once a narrow and isolating path, had become a quiet procession of respect. In the first rows, more people had turned. The cabin wasn't buzzing anymore, it was holding its breath. At the front, seat 1A sat empty and ready. The wide leather cushion, the generous leg room, the quiet hum of space. The flight attendant stepped aside as Jonathan approached. She gestured to the seat with a quiet reverence. He paused just a moment, then slowly lowered himself into the seat. The relief on his face was subtle but real. There were no speeches, no announcements, just a return to place. A correction, of course. And though the aircraft still hadn't moved, something else had shifted entirely. As the aircraft remained stationary on the tarmac, the cabin slowly exhaled the tension of the last few minutes. The wheels had stopped moving, but the energy inside the plane had only begun to shift. The crew resumed quiet checks at the front, preparing for a second departure sequence. Seatbelt signs remained illuminated, and the muted voice of ground control occasionally echoed through the cockpit's radio system. Yet the eyes of the passengers were no longer focused on overhead bins or seatback screens. They were fixed on what had just happened. A moment of recognition, a quiet correction. Captain Eric Sloan stood once more at the front of the cabin. He faced the rows of passengers who now watched him with silent expectation. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he reach for the intercom. Instead, he stepped forward into the aisle and spoke clearly, his voice carrying without force. He addressed the cabin with the cadence of someone used to giving orders. But now, there was something softer layered beneath, the weight of responsibility and the acknowledgement of failure. He told them that every passenger matters, that all aboard deserve respect and safety, but that sometimes someone on the flight has carried more than a boarding pass. He spoke not of rank or awards, but of sacrifice, of unseen burdens borne quietly over decades. He said the aircraft could not and would not depart, while injustice remained seated unnoticed in the back. He reminded them that service comes in many forms, but some forms should never be forgotten. The cabin remained absolutely still. There were no murmurs, no shuffling, just a complete collective silence, as if each passenger held their breath. Sloan paused only briefly before finishing. Then, without waiting for acknowledgement, he nodded once to the crew and returned to the cockpit. What followed was not immediate noise, but something smaller and more sincere. One person clapped, then another, and another. The applause spread through the cabin in quiet ripples, not explosive or ceremonial, but genuine. It moved row by row, hands coming together in steady rhythm. No one cheered. There were no whistles or outbursts. It was not a celebration. It was respect, given in the only way many of them knew how. In seat 1A, Jonathan Webster sat quietly. He didn't move or turn around. He kept his gaze out the window, watching the sunlight shimmer across the runway. His hands rested lightly in his lap, and a small bottle of water sat untouched on the tray table. A few minutes earlier, one of the attendants had brought him a blanket, soft and neatly folded. He hadn't asked for it, but he accepted it with a quiet nod, his expression unreadable. The seat beside him remained empty. Whether by coincidence or decision, no one had been placed next to him. He breathed slowly, letting the moment settle. It wasn't comfort that filled the seat, it was something deeper, a stillness that felt earned. Not a reward, but the return of something long dormant, identity, dignity, recognition. As the flight leveled out hours later and cabin service resumed, a man from the middle of the aircraft rose from his seat. He moved down the aisle with quiet urgency, stopping at the front where Jonathan sat. He was young, perhaps in his late 30s, dressed in jeans and a nondescript sweater, a wedding ring on his hand, a slight nervousness in his steps. He introduced himself softly. Not to the cabin, not for attention, just to Jonathan. He had read about him, he said, his missions, his citations. He mentioned his father, who had once served under Jonathan in a forward operating base near the Mekong Delta, a man he had spoken of often, who had respected his commanding officer, not just for orders given, but for the way he listened after battles ended. The young man said he had never imagined he'd meet Jonathan Webster face to face. He had seen the name on the manifest during check-in and had felt a strange tug of familiarity. Now he knew why. Jonathan didn't speak immediately. His eyes, tired and distant just moments earlier, now focused. Not with alertness, but with warmth. He nodded slowly once. The exchange was brief, nearly silent, but it meant more than any formal citation, more than any decoration could ever offer. He was remembered. The man returned to his seat, and the flight continued. But something had changed. Jonathan no longer felt like a forgotten passenger in a crowded machine. He was not just a seat number, not just another quiet figure moving through anonymous terminals. For the first time in years, the weight he carried was seen, not lifted, not erased, but acknowledged. and that, more than anything else, was enough. The wheels touched down on the Seattle tarmac just past noon, the landing gear meeting the runway with a soft, grounded thud. The engine slowed to a steady hum as the aircraft eased toward the gate, and for a few moments the cabin was filled only with the sounds of buckles being unfastened and passengers retrieving belongings from under seats and overhead compartments. The city outside lay under a calm, overcast sky, the kind that seemed to blanket the world in a muted silver light. Jonathan Webster remained seated as the rows ahead of him began to rise. He didn't rush. He waited, hands still folded, his gaze resting on the skyline just visible through the small window. The outline of the airport terminals, the glint of aircraft wings in the distance, and the quiet movement of ground crews all drifted through his vision like a slow-moving tide. He had made this journey not to be seen, but in the end, he had been. When the forward cabin doors opened and passengers began to disembark, the flight crew stood at the front to see them off. A few passengers paused to speak with Jonathan. Some nodded. One or two offered a quiet handshake. No one said much, but the gestures held weight. The flight attendants, each of them, offered him personal thanks as he passed. They didn't use titles, didn't rehearse formalities, just looked him in the eye and let their expressions do the rest. He stepped off the plane with slow, deliberate motion, his bag in one hand, the rolled blanket tucked under the other arm. His gait, while still marked by age and injury, carried something different now. There was less caution, less guardedness. His shoulders were straight, his step was sure. At the edge of the arrivals hall, just beyond the security barrier, his daughter waited. She held a bouquet of sunflowers, bright and simple, wrapped in brown paper. Her eyes scanned the line of passengers until she saw him, and in that moment her posture changed. She waved once, then began to walk, then to run. He spotted her before she reached him, and for a fleeting second, he looked like a man 30 years younger. They met near the baggage carousel. No words. She wrapped her arms around him, and he let out a laugh, light, unforced, one that rose from somewhere deep in his chest. She hadn't heard that sound from him in years. It was rough at the edges, but unmistakably full of joy. They drove home through the city, catching up in quiet bursts. Jonathan didn't speak much about the flight. When she asked, he simply said it had gone well. He mentioned the aisle seat had been changed, that he had ended up by the window instead, that the view on approach had been beautiful. That was all. Later in the evening, after dinner and conversation, when the family had dispersed to their corners of the house and the gentle domestic noise had quieted, Jonathan retreated to the study. The room was modest, filled with worn books, an old armchair, and a wooden desk scattered with letters and photos. The city lights outside the window flickered faintly in the fog. He sat at the desk and opened the side pocket of his duffel. From it, he drew a white envelope with a blue Pacific Sky logo in the corner. Inside was a typed letter, neatly formatted, signed at the bottom by a member of the airline's Veterans Council. The language was formal but heartfelt, an apology, a recognition of service, and a confirmation that Jonathan Webster had been designated a lifetime guest of honor. No more booking fees, no restrictions. Just a number to call when he needed to travel. They would take care of the rest. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside a small wooden box on the desk. In the box were other keepsakes. An old photo of himself in uniform, standing beside a fighter jet, the edges curled from time, a bronze medal, a faded postcard sent from a base halfway around the world. He added the new letter without ceremony. It did not erase anything else in the box, but it belonged there now. Jonathan didn't need recognition. He had lived a full life without it. But being seen just once more had settled something within him, something that had lived unnamed for decades. Later that night, he sat in the living room alone. The window was slightly open, letting in the cool Seattle air. The streetlights cast a golden sheen across the sidewalk outside. Inside, everything was quiet. He leaned back in the armchair and allowed himself a long, slow breath. He didn't think of medals or ranks. He didn't think of speeches or salutes. He thought only of the fact that someone had looked at him and remembered, and that, in a world that so often moved too fast to notice, was more than enough. That night, Jonathan Webster was not a forgotten passenger, not a faded file in an archive, not a man silently enduring. He was simply a father, a grandfather, and for the first time in a long time, a man who knew that his story still mattered.